The snow-crusted mountain town was exactly as bleak as I'd been warned. Population barely 30, and even that felt like a stretch considering half the houses were hollowed, boarded up with rotting timber. I'd been drawn here for work. Money really, and the old mountain folk barely looked up as I entered their town. Most of them with eyes fixed to the ground, grizzled beards hiding silent lips. My job was simple. Restore the abandoned bus route that ran along a winding road to each forgotten cluster of homes. The contract was generous, a pay grade higher than anything I'd seen, and they promised a bonus for each stop I managed to reconnect with. Just finish the route, they told me. No need to stick around after. The bus they handed me was a beast, the yellow exterior dulled to a rusted brown, with remnants of the old route still on display inside, like someone had just closed the doors one night and walked away for good. I'd been given the route map, handed to me by one of the town's elders who held it out as though reluctant to even touch it. "Make sure to follow it exactly," he said, voice a low rasp that echoed through the narrow office. The walls plastered with old photos of the town from back when its bus routes were used daily. He seemed to consider his words before he continued, eyes half hidden beneath a moth-eaten cap, his fingers trembling as he pushed the paper toward me. "And make sure you follow the rules. You'll want to memorize those. They're the only thing that'll keep you safe if something goes wrong." I wasn't one to question things that had no business being answered, so I skimmed the paper, which had barely legible handwriting that looked like it had been scratched onto the map in a hurry, the edges crinkled, faded, and torn. Rules for a bus route seemed strange, to say the least, but the contract was clear. Follow the route and make sure the bus stays running, no questions asked. The list read, 1. Do not enter bus number 502 at any stop after 7 p.m. If you see it idling on the road, turn off all lights and do not approach. 2. Each stop on the route must be completed in order, and you must follow the map precisely. If you take a wrong turn, find your way back immediately. 3. If you hear a passenger calling for help from outside the bus, do not answer. Do not exit and do not look out the window. 4. When approaching stop number 6, you may see a flickering light in the forest. Do not investigate it and never let the bus idle near the trees. If it does, shut off the engine and wait until the light disappears. 5. If, at any time, the number of passengers on the bus does not match the number on your route list, end the route and drive directly back to the station. Do not acknowledge any new passengers. 6. At the final stop, if you see the faint figure of a man with a broad-brimmed hat and a coat by the side of the road, do not make eye contact. Count to 10 silently and wait for him to disappear. 7. If you find a passenger has left behind any items, especially a coat or umbrella, burn it in the furnace at the station without looking too closely. It's not theirs anymore. With each rule I read, I felt the chill of the mountain air seep deeper into my bones. The elder just watched, his eyes a shade of gray that almost seemed sad, like he knew something he wasn't telling me. What happened to the last person on this route? I asked, though as soon as the words left my mouth, I knew I didn't want the answer. You'll be fine as long as you follow what's written, he said, sidestepping my question. Keep the route, keep the routine, and don't look too close. With the route map stuffed into my coat pocket and the bus keys cold and heavy in my hand, I made my way to the bus lot where bus number 502 loomed. The windows, once clean, were streaked with grime, and the faded yellow of its exterior was masked by streaks of rust that gave the whole thing an abandoned, almost forgotten look. I thought I heard something creak as I stepped inside, but I brushed it off as the old machinery settling. On the first night, things went smoothly. The route wound through thick, snow-draped trees, the headlights cutting through layers of fog that settled heavily in patches along the road. Each stop was isolated, shrouded in silence, the small towns barely a flash of dim streetlights as I passed through. I kept my eyes on the road, and despite the hollow, unsettling quiet that clung to each stop, I got through without incident. The second night, however, was different. It was just after 6:30 when I saw another bus up ahead on a sharp turn. Bus number 502, idling on the side of the road. It was a twin to mine, down to the dented fender and grimy windows, but the inside was dark, abandoned, and yet I couldn't shake the feeling I was being watched from somewhere inside. I turned off my lights, just like the rule had warned, and parked a distance away, my breath coming in short, controlled gasps. The old bus sat in place, not moving, though I swore I heard a faint hum echoing through the trees. It stayed there until the clock struck 7, and then the bus simply disappeared, as if swallowed by the shadows. I drove on, unnerved but unwilling to back out just yet. It was after stop number 3 that the real trouble began. I heard it, soft, almost a whisper, from the back of the bus. A voice, fragile, like someone calling out in the cold. "Please help, I'm lost." My hands gripped the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The rule came back to me. If you hear a passenger calling for help from outside the bus, do not answer. Do not exit and do not look out the window. I focused ahead, ignoring the pleading tone, though the voice only grew louder, desperate. There was a scratching noise against the window near the back, like nails on glass, and I forced myself to ignore it, my eyes fixed firmly on the road until the sound faded. At stop number 6, a light flickered deep within the woods, a faint, almost ghostly glow that danced between the trees. It pulsed, irregular, and as I slowed the bus, I remembered the warning. Do not investigate it, and never let the bus idle near the trees. The light seemed to grow closer, or maybe it was an illusion, but I shut off the engine and waited, barely breathing as the glow dimmed, then vanished completely. The further I went, the stranger things became. Some nights, I'd catch glimpses of shadows in the mirrors, figures that vanished the second I tried to get a better look. One night, I thought I saw someone sitting in the back row, just a silhouette, unmoving. But when I turned around, there was no one there, only an empty seat that seemed to radiate a lingering cold. At each stop, I found myself counting the seats, making sure there were no new passengers. And then one night, I noticed a coat left behind on the last row, a heavy, old-fashioned overcoat with pockets that sagged with something unseen. I didn't dare look too closely, just followed the rule and took it back to the station, tossing it into the furnace without question, though I swore I saw something shift in the flames, like the shape of a hand reaching out before it crumbled into ash. I kept to the route, forcing myself to follow every turn on the map precisely, though the mountain road grew steeper, more treacherous with each passing night. The snow fell heavier now, muffling the sound of the engine as I climbed, and sometimes, in the silence, I'd hear footsteps behind me, like someone pacing along the aisle. The radio crackled, cutting in and out with strange voices that almost sounded familiar. But when I tried to make out the words, the static drowned everything out. One night at the final stop, I saw him, a man with a broad-brimmed hat, standing by the side of the road, his figure barely a shadow against the snow. I averted my gaze, counting to 10, each second stretching into a silent eternity, my pulse pounding as I waited for him to disappear. The rules weren't just warnings. They were survival tactics, each one a line I knew I couldn't cross. The night air felt sharper, colder, with a bitterness that gnawed through my coat as I sat parked on the mountain road, my fingers shaking slightly from the cold or something else I didn't want to name. I watched the route carefully, my eyes scanning the forest edges for movement, though I had no idea what I was expecting to see. The headlights carved two thin beams through the darkness, illuminating patches of frost on the ground and casting eerie shadows that seemed to flicker, almost alive. I'd made it through 6 stops without incident, yet a feeling of wrongness clung to the route tonight, heavier than before. The forest seemed closer somehow, the trees leaning inward, as if they were crowding around the bus, curious about what I was doing here, a foreigner intruding on their ancient, frozen silence. The radio crackled to life suddenly, filling the bus with static and then cutting to silence, as if something had tried to push through but was lost to the white noise. I adjusted the dial, my hands fumbling with the old knobs, trying to bring in a clear signal. I wasn't expecting much. It had barely worked since I'd started this job, usually just blaring out bursts of static or, once or twice, snatches of distant voices, low and murmuring. Tonight, though, a voice came through. It was faint, more of a whisper, almost drowned out by the static, but I could swear I heard it. "Do you know what you're driving?" the voice asked, soft and unnervingly calm, the words cutting through the crackling as if spoken directly into my ear. My hand froze on the dial, a chill running down my spine as I tried to place the voice, but it was gone, dissolved back into the static before I could catch another word. I kept driving, pushing away the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. The next stop was up ahead, a small clearing surrounded by towering pines that loomed like dark sentries in the night. I pulled the bus to a stop, my eyes flicking toward the mirrors to make sure the aisle was empty. There was no movement, only the faint reflection of the frost-covered seats and shadows that seemed to shift slightly with each glance. Then, as I sat there watching, I noticed something strange. A figure, faint like an outline, sitting in the 3rd row from the back. The shape was barely visible, more a suggestion of a person than a solid form, but it was there, unmoving. I blinked, my mind racing to explain it away as a trick of the headlights or a shadow cast by the trees. But as I looked closer, it seemed to become clearer, more defined. I forced myself to look away, clutching the steering wheel until my knuckles turned white. I'd read the rule. If the number of passengers didn't match the route list, I was to end the route immediately, no questions asked. But the route list was blank. I hadn't been assigned passengers. I was the only one supposed to be here. I took a deep breath, trying to steady my nerves as I started the engine again, keeping my gaze firmly on the road ahead, ignoring the uneasy sensation of eyes watching me from behind. The radio crackled again, a soft, rhythmic hum that almost sounded like breathing, and then a voice, low and urgent, broke through. "Turn around," it said, the words almost drowned by the static. I felt a shiver run through me, my eyes flicking to the mirrors instinctively, but the aisle was empty. There was no one there. Still, the voice lingered, the command repeating, though fainter this time. "Turn around." I kept my hands steady on the wheel, refusing to give in to the instinct to look over my shoulder. I focused on the next rule, mentally rehearsing the list as I navigated the winding road. By the time I reached stop number 7, I was starting to question everything. The stop itself was just a deserted clearing, blanketed in snow, the air silent except for the soft rustling of branches in the wind. I opened the doors, half expecting someone to step on, though I knew that wasn't part of the route tonight. Instead, a faint gust of wind blew into the bus, carrying with it a scent that seemed oddly familiar, faint, like burnt matches and damp earth. I glanced around, but there was nothing out there, only the endless stretch of trees and shadows. I was about to close the doors when I heard it, a soft, almost tentative knocking, like someone tapping on glass. I looked toward the windows, expecting to see something, but there was nothing there. The knocking continued, though persistent, coming from the side window. I turned slowly, my eyes scanning the frosted glass, but still, I saw nothing. I shut the doors and continued, my hands gripping the wheel tightly, my heartbeat pounding in my ears. The knocking faded, though a sense of being watched lingered, prickling the back of my neck as I drove. The route map was still in my coat pocket, its edges crumpled from being handled too often, and I pulled it out during a momentary stop, tracing the faded lines and notations with my finger. The road was supposed to be straightforward, a loop that would take me back to the station by dawn, but as I looked closer, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A faint line, almost invisible, branching off from the main route. It wasn't marked with a stop, just a thin, barely there line that wound deeper into the forest. I hadn't noticed it when I first looked at the map, but now it seemed almost deliberate, like it had been added as an afterthought or perhaps something meant to be hidden. Against my better judgment, I decided to follow the main route, ignoring the offshoot, though a strange curiosity gnawed at me. As I drove, I couldn't shake the feeling that the map was shifting somehow, the lines seeming to warp, as if urging me to take that hidden path. The headlights caught glimpses of trees, twisted and ancient, their branches clawing at the sky like skeletal fingers. I forced myself to stay on course, repeating the rules in my head as a way to keep myself grounded. But just as I neared the next stop, I caught sight of something in the rearview mirror, a figure standing on the side of the road, barely visible in the dim light. He wore a broad-brimmed hat, his face obscured by shadows, his posture rigid and unmoving. My pulse quickened as I remembered the rule: do not make eye contact. Count to 10 and wait for him to disappear. I kept my gaze fixed on the road, counting silently, each second stretching into a painful eternity. I could feel his presence, almost like he was watching me, his gaze heavy and unyielding. By the time I reached 10, I risked a quick glance in the mirror, and he was gone, the road empty once more. But the air inside the bus felt colder, and I swore I could see frost forming on the windows, delicate patterns that spiraled and twisted like vines creeping across the glass. I continued on, my nerves frayed, feeling as if I was being pulled deeper into something far older and darker than I could understand. At the next stop, I hesitated, my hand hovering over the door controls as I debated whether to even open them. But the protocol was clear. Each stop had to be completed in order, no exceptions. I opened the doors, half expecting to see another shadow waiting, but the clearing was empty, silent except for the faint rustling of leaves in the wind. I was about to close the doors when I noticed something lying on the ground just outside, barely visible in the dim light. It was a coat, old and worn, with patches of fabric peeling away, and something about it seemed wrong, as if it didn't belong there. I remembered the rule: if you find a passenger has left behind any items, especially a coat or umbrella, burn it in the furnace at the station without looking too closely. I leaned out slightly, feeling a strange compulsion to examine it more closely, but something held me back, a voice in my head whispering warnings. The coat lay there, unmoving, yet it seemed almost alive, like it was waiting for something or someone. I shut the doors quickly, feeling a chill settle over me as I continued on the route, the image of that coat etched into my mind. The further I drove, the more the rules felt like lifelines, each one a barrier holding something back, something that lurked just beyond the edge of the route, waiting for a misstep. As the bus trundled forward through the dense night, the weight of my own breath felt suffocating, heavy with something unseen that clung to the air like an invisible fog. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had fundamentally changed, like the entire route was shifting around me, bending into unfamiliar shapes and angles that weren't there before. The forest outside grew thicker, the trees closer together, their gnarled branches hanging low, some of them brushing against the windows in a way that felt intentional, as if they were reaching for the bus or for me. My hands gripped the wheel, knuckles whitening, every nerve in my body buzzing with a primal instinct screaming for me to turn back, to abandon this journey entirely. But I was too far in now, the road behind lost in darkness, and I couldn't even remember the way back to the depot. As I neared the next stop, my stomach churned with an unease that bordered on nausea, but I forced myself to maintain focus, counting through the stops in my head like a mantra to keep myself grounded. Yet, as the bus rolled into the clearing, the headlights illuminated something that froze me in place, my heart slamming against my ribs. Standing in the middle of the road, lit up in the stark beams of the headlights, was another bus. It was identical in every detail. The same faded paint, the same worn-out number stenciled on the side, the same pattern of frost clinging to the windows. My own bus, but it was empty, dark, lifeless, as if abandoned in the dead of night. For a moment, I sat there in a daze, unable to process what I was seeing. My mind tried to rationalize it, cycling through every possibility, but none of them made sense. How could my bus be sitting in the road in front of me? I was sitting in it, driving it. I glanced down, almost expecting my own hands to vanish, to wake up from this twisted vision. But I was still here, the steering wheel solid beneath my fingers, the faint hum of the engine vibrating under my seat. I flicked my gaze back to the other bus, squinting through the windshield, and that's when I noticed something that sent a cold shiver down my spine. There was a figure inside, sitting in the driver's seat. He looked exactly like me. Same coat, same hat, the same expression of fear frozen on his face. He was slumped over the wheel, as if asleep or worse, and as I watched, his head slowly lifted, his gaze meeting mine through the layers of glass and darkness. The eyes staring back were hollow, black voids that seemed to absorb the light, and his mouth twisted into a smile, a cold, lifeless grin that felt like a crack in the fabric of reality itself. I couldn't look away, trapped in his gaze, feeling as though he was pulling something out of me, draining me. This wasn't just a reflection, it was me, or rather, something pretending to be me, sitting in a bus that should not exist. The radio crackled to life again, but this time, the voice was familiar, disturbingly so. It was my own voice, distorted and garbled, repeating a single phrase over and over. "Leave the road. Leave the road." The words looped endlessly, growing louder, more frantic, as if my own voice was trying to warn me, begging me to turn back, to leave this place before it was too late. But where could I go? The road behind was gone, swallowed by the darkness, and the forest pressed in closer, the trees towering like sentinels, ancient and unforgiving. I forced myself to look away from the other bus, my mind reeling with terror as I pressed down on the accelerator, veering around the empty shell of my own vehicle, desperate to escape whatever nightmare I had stumbled into. As I drove, my heart pounding. The lights from my own bus faded in the mirrors, but the feeling of being watched intensified, a prickling sensation crawling up my spine. I could sense movement in the back of the bus, faint shadows flickering at the edge of my vision, but I didn't dare look. The rules pounded in my mind, fragments of warnings that now felt like thin walls barely holding back something monstrous. And then, in the midst of my frantic thoughts, I realized something horrifying. The bus route had no end. There was no station waiting for me at the other side. I wasn't heading toward any destination. I was being led deeper, drawn into something far beyond the realm of ordinary roads and forest trails. I checked the map again, hands shaking, hoping for some glimmer of clarity, but the route had changed. Lines that were once straightforward had twisted, looping back on themselves, creating a tangled maze that seemed impossible to navigate. And then I noticed something that sent a fresh wave of terror through me. My own name was scrawled on the map in shaky, frantic handwriting, marked at a stop that I hadn't seen before, a stop far off the original route, deep in the heart of the forest. The letters were uneven, as though written in a hurry, and next to my name, in blood-red ink, was a single word: arrival. My mind raced, every instinct screaming at me to stop the bus, to turn around, to find any way back to reality. But the road stretched on, endless, looping back into itself in impossible angles. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles aching, and that's when I felt it. The faintest touch on my shoulder, cold and lingering, like a whisper of frost seeping into my skin. I froze, fear clawing at my throat, but I didn't dare look back. I remembered the rule about unseen passengers, the one that warned never to acknowledge them. But as the pressure on my shoulder grew, a whisper brushed past my ear, soft and menacing. A voice that sounded like my own but twisted, warped by something ancient and malicious. "You were never supposed to leave," it said, the words coiling around me like a noose. In a surge of desperation, I stomped on the brakes, the bus skidding to a halt on the icy road, the headlights casting distorted shadows against the trees. I didn't know what I was expecting, but the silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the faint sound of breathing that seemed to fill the bus, echoing off the walls, growing louder, closer. The doors creaked open on their own, as if inviting something in, and a cold wind swept through the aisle, carrying with it that familiar scent of burnt matches and damp earth. I sat frozen in the driver's seat, every muscle tense, feeling the presence draw closer, each step heavy, deliberate, as though savoring every inch it gained. And then, as the shadow reached the edge of my vision, I heard a final whispered phrase, a warning that seemed to come from within me, spoken in my own voice but filled with an unimaginable dread. "If you see yourself, run." I took a shaky breath, my mind racing as I considered my options. The road stretched on, dark and unyielding, no destination in sight, only the unending labyrinth of the forest pressing in from both sides. I took one last look at the tangled map, my eyes catching on something I hadn't noticed before. Scrawled along the edges of the route were tiny, cryptic notes, half erased and almost hidden in the ink's fading streaks. My hands trembled as I traced the words. They weren't instructions or route markers. They were messages, left in the same shaky handwriting as the word arrival by my name. The notes were short, simple warnings, things like, "Don't look at the reflection," "Stay quiet if you feel it," and a final, bone-chilling command at the very bottom: "Once you find yourself, it's too late." I glanced up and caught my reflection in the rearview mirror, but it wasn't mine. The other me sat in the back row, staring straight ahead with hollow eyes and that same eerie, lifeless grin. His expression was vacant, as though waiting for me to acknowledge him, for me to break the fragile barrier that held back whatever nightmare lingered just behind the veil of his stare. My hands gripped the wheel as I forced myself to look away, repeating the rules in my head like a lifeline, trying to keep a grip on my sanity. Yet I could feel the air thickening with something unnatural, a presence that closed in on all sides, surrounding me, pressing down with an overwhelming sense of inevitability. Suddenly, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a slip of paper lying on the dashboard. It was another note, freshly scrawled in the same desperate handwriting as before. My stomach twisted as I unfolded it, my eyes scanning the words that seemed to pulse with an unnatural energy. The note read, "Stop driving and leave the bus. This is your last chance." The words echoed in my mind, and I realized with a growing sense of dread that I had reached the end of whatever path this was. I glanced out the window and saw a faint glimmer of light through the trees, the outline of a small clearing that offered a glimpse of escape, a way back to the real world. Heart pounding, I forced myself up, my legs numb as I stumbled toward the door. I stepped onto the cold ground, the forest silent, suffocating in its stillness, and as I looked back, my blood ran cold. The bus's windows were no longer empty. Row after row, shadowy figures now filled every seat, their faces turned toward me, expressions vacant yet accusing, each one bearing an eerie resemblance to me, slight variations, older, younger, twisted in horror, silent screams frozen on their lips. And there, in the driver's seat, was the other version of me, his hollow eyes gleaming, his grin stretching too wide as he lifted his hand in a slow, mocking wave. I felt the weight of 1,000 stares pressing into me, an unnatural pull urging me to step back on board, to reclaim the seat waiting for me. But I turned, the primal terror forcing me forward, running toward the clearing without looking back, leaving the cursed bus and its haunting passengers to fade into the darkness as I escaped into the night. I didn't even think twice about going back. I took the money I was owed, signed off without a word, and left the bus route behind, barely able to shake the lingering sense that something was still watching. For weeks, every time I closed my eyes, I'd see the empty road stretching endlessly into darkness, hear the hum of the engine, feel that chilling presence lingering just out of sight. I told myself it was over, that I was safe, but deep down I knew some roads are better left untraveled.